Um, okay, great, thank you. Yes, so thank you for that introduction. If you've looked at a news item any time in the last couple of days or last couple of years, you'll know a thing or two about Ukraine, you'll probably know a thing or two about Israel and Palestine, and maybe not that much else. And that's the issue that we're going to be addressing today. I didn't think that we were going to have a connection with the previous presentation, but in fact we do. That very informative slide about the imbalances in representation in psychology is something that we're going to see very much in the news media. And in the previous presentation we heard about East versus West. Well, Japan occupies a very interesting position in this because it's kind of neither East nor West. And we'll look at it more in the sense of perhaps North and South in today's presentation. So yes, all three of us are at Osaka University, the Osaka School of International Public Policy. We're all working on issues to do with the news media. And we've sort of combined our forces here. A very slight conflict of interest is that we also have been creating this global news view, which we're going to be presenting today as a solution to the problems with international media coverage. So we'll be talking about the problem, we'll be talking about the cause, and then we'll be providing a very, very biased solution. So please look forward to that. Let me first hand over the microphone to Delio Wilson Zandamela. He's working a lot on, actually, yes, before I hand it over to him, let me just give the layout. So first we'll have Delio, who's going to talk about media representation of low-income countries. Then I will follow that up with a talk about the determinants of Japanese world media coverage. That means the coverage of the world by the Japanese media. And then finally, Namie will present us with the solution. So she'll give an overview of the sort of organization that we've created to try to deal with some of these issues, at least in the Japanese context. Delio has been working on media coverage of especially Mozambique, and he's looking at it from two angles. The angle from the way in which Mozambique is covered by the international media, in particular Portugal, and then also the way it's covered in the local media in Mozambique. And he'll talk mostly today about the international side of things, but if you're interested, you can catch him later. I'm sure he's got a lot to say about how Mozambique is covered by the Mozambican media. But anyway, first of all, let me hand over the floor to Delio to talk about media representation of low-income countries.
Thank you very much, Professor Hawkins. My name is Delio Wilson. I would like to talk about how low-income countries are represented in media or not represented on media. Most of the time, when we open newspapers or TV, we'll see same countries or same issues, and things are happening around the world and often are ignored. So we'll try to understand why these things are ignored and what is happening. One of the ways of here, there is a lot of stereotypes and oversimplification of news related to low-income countries. And you also have poverty and crisis focus. So the negativity takes huge space when it comes to media coverage of low-income countries. So when there's a conflict somewhere in Africa, or you will see negative, of course negative because it's a conflict, but the oversimplification when they're choosing, for example, the images to show, it's always the shocking, the chaos, the hunger, the guns. So this is what you will see in most of the cases. Even when they are reporting facts that are not related to hunger, they're not related to conflict. Often the visuals that they will bring will be the worst that they can find in a country. I saw a piece by The Guardian that was talking about a new center of malaria in Mozambique, my country. And they took a picture in the most remote area of the city, but the piece was not talking about that remote area. It was talking about an innovative center that was bringing solution to malaria, but the negativity will have dominance in coverage of these countries. And we also have the idea of victimization and dependence narratives. They will always bring this idea that these countries need help, we need to assist them, we need to send resources to them. One-dimensional portrays and ignoring the complex narrative. The conflict, sometimes they have their own roots, their own histories, their own complexity that you have to explain, and most of the time in articles that we find, you don't find that. It's oversimplified. It's often the idea, the stereotype view that, okay, maybe that is an ethnic conflict. Most of the time it's not ethnic conflict, but I don't know who brought this idea that conflicts in Africa are all ethnic conflict. They are fighting each other. They are used to fight. They used to fight, and it's been like that. So this cultural stereotype and lack of research and context impact the coverage of low-income countries, especially in Africa. I put these two countries, DRC Congo and Israel and Palestine. Why? And if I may ask a question, like what was the country that you saw like more on TV? Obviously you will see Israel and Palestine, but the conflict in DRC Congo have been around since the 90s, and more than 6 million people died in that conflict, and still ongoing. And there is a lot of UN resolution about the DRC Congo, but it's not on the media. So we want to understand why it's not on the media. And representation of successful success stories. It's very difficult when you see good things happening, like new infrastructure, economy, democratization, and it's not covered in the media. Things like peace agreements, regime change happening. Some countries been like in dictatorship, or Angola, for example, the former president was in power for almost 14 years. And in recent 5 years, we had regime change, and it was not a major issue on the agenda of the news outlets. Things like innovation and technology, when an African country launched a satellite, or we can remember during the COVID, the pandemic, the South African scientists bringing solutions, and it was completely ignored. So those are important factors. So what are the possible reasons? So we brought here the idea of hierarchy of influences model. So in the case of the conflict in Mozambique, Mozambique have been facing like insurgency in the north part. The province is called Cabo Delgado. So Al-Shabaab have been attacking and partially occupied Cabo Delgado for 2 or 3 years from 2017. And I've been looking at how the Portuguese media is covering the conflict in Cabo Delgado. It was not that significant. I also checked articles from other major newspapers. I searched the word Cabo Delgado in the New York Times using Lexis Uni, and less than 20 articles were there, but was a significant conflict with more than 2 million people dead, and there's no significant articles about this conflict. No one knows what is going on. So the hierarchy of influences model suggests that there are 5 different levels. 5 different levels. So the first one is the individual level. So the journalist, who are they? In the case of Portugal, most of them are white. They have family, for example, that have been in Mozambique during colonization, because Mozambique was colonized by Portugal. They are Christian. So the values of the individual will have a significant impact on how he will write about certain conflict or certain country. But you also have the second level, the routines. What are they doing, like inside of the newsroom? The process of the process of gatekeeping of the news, when they receive the news, when they have to take the decision to put a certain news stories on the agenda. So if it's not a routine to consider this kind of conflict or this kind of stories, this will be often ignored. And you also have the idea of romanticization. Portugal, because Portugal colonized Mozambique, but there is always this romanticization. If you see their articles, they remember that, okay, this used to be Portugal, this used to be us. So the story will not show Mozambique is a different country. It's kind of continuation of what it used to be. You also have the organizational level, where you have the funding and advertisement. So this is very important, because if the stories that you're bringing on your newspapers don't increase the readership, you will not get significant money, or if you don't have enough advertisement on your newspaper, probably you'll not be able to publish certain stories. And also, the fourth level, the social institution level, that deals with the governmental influence. So the policies or governmental influence also can impact on how the local agency will talk about a certain country, because often when the bilateral relations are good, the delegation, the presidential delegation can bring its own journalists and they can report locally. And again, if they don't have enough funding, they don't have representatives, they don't have offices in those countries, it will be a little bit more complicated to get accurate stories. In case of Portugal, they use local Mozambican journalists to send their article, freelancers. But some newspapers do have one African representative who have to cover sometimes 10 countries. How can you talk about different stories on 10 countries, and most of the time the office is located in South Africa. So it's really challenging. Also, the last level, the social system, it's more political and economical organization. It tells us a lot about if the democracy is, but I don't think this has a huge, the last level doesn't have a huge impact because Mozambique is democracy, also Portugal is democracy, and both of them are free countries. So this is what I have. We'll hand up to Professor Hawkins. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Delio. Okay, so let's move on now to the Japanese context. A lot of what was just said will also apply to the Japanese context. We can see the same sort of levels of hierarchy of influences, I think, in the Japanese media. But I want to add just a little bit more, let's say, add a few more numbers, a little bit more sort of statistical data. But let's start with this map here that kind of looks like the map we saw about the study of psychology, the subjects of psychology. This is a map that is based on the three major daily broadsheet newspapers in Japan, the Asahi, the Mainichi, and the Yomiuri. And this shows where their coverage of the world is concentrated. And we have a massive scale to choose from, all levels of blue that you can imagine, from really, really dark blue to really, really light blue to almost white. But it seems we didn't need that many levels because it's like either you get covered or you get nothing. There's no gradation. There's no sort of levels. There's no in between. It's either you exist or you do not exist. And that's the way the Japanese media is. So if you are the US, if you are China, if you are North Korea, if you are South Korea, you exist. If you are the UK, if you are France, if you are Germany, if you are Russia, you kind of exist. And well, this is from 2019. If you saw this today, and we are doing this, updating this fairly regularly, let's just say that Ukraine would be a deepest possible shade of blue that you can imagine. But you can see that basically the African continent that we've just heard about, totally missing in action. Latin America, missing in action. And oddly, Southeast Asia, missing in action. Now, when I say oddly, because we might expect, okay, when I talk to people about this, when I talk to journalists about this, yeah, Africa's far away, Latin America's so far away. It's far away. It's out there. It doesn't affect us. It doesn't affect us. And then, so my next step is to say, okay, let me talk to you about Southeast Asia. And so what the research about this kind of thing has revealed, or let's say Western studies about Western media has revealed this kind of thing. What is it that determines our world media coverage? And you might say, well, if it's a big country, if it's an important country, then it will get coverage, right? So how do we measure that? Is it square area? Is it population? Is it GDP? So you're rich as a country, as in big as a country, right? You have a lot of people. Okay, that kind of works. So we can say, yes, well, Lesotho is not really a very big country, so we can understand if they don't get covered. But the relations with the country in question also become really, really critical. And this is why Delio is talking about the link between Portugal and Mozambique, right? Because we're looking at historical, cultural, linguistic. And we can see this also in a lot of other media throughout the world, right? That if you are an English-speaking country in Africa, you're more likely to get covered by the BBC. If you're a French-speaking country, you're more likely to get covered by the French media, et cetera, et cetera. And it might be, yes, were you colonized by this country or not? But what often shows up in a lot of the research is, and the distance article also works, right? It's far away, so it's not so important. That also works. But one thing that really that shows up quite often is trade, because you can really measure this, right? You can really take, okay, how much bilateral trade do we have with this country, and how much coverage is it getting? Okay, is there a relationship between those figures? And in many cases, from studies at least done in the US, the answer is yes, trade does matter. So your economic relations with another country have an impact on whether you get covered. But we could also imagine a couple of other things, one perhaps being the influence of other countries. So we might imagine that there's a gravitational pull from a powerful country. And this feeds into research about international news flow. So who has the power to control information? Who has the power to gather and process and project that information? And so we look back to some of the work that was done in UNESCO, in the committees in UNESCO in the 1970s and 80s, that sort of showed us that, well, look, so much of the world's news is dominated by this handful of media organizations. So we could imagine that those sorts of things might matter. Okay, so what we did is we did a sort of statistical analysis of the Japanese media for 2019. We chose 2019 because things got messy after COVID and Ukraine, but okay, let's go back in time a little bit when things were a little bit more settled. So that's 2019. So we looked at all of these variables. We tried to see what matters. What for the Japanese media? We looked at the Asahi, the Yomiuri, and the Mainichi. We looked at these three major newspapers, and we sort of added things up and saw which, we made a list. Okay, how far are these places from Tokyo? So let's measure that distance and see if there's a relationship. Let's measure the trade between Japan and that country. Let's measure the GDP. Let's measure population. And then finally, let's see if this gravitational pull of other countries exist, specifically US, specifically New York Times. And what we found is that, yes, population matters. If you're a big country in terms of population, it matters. If you're far away, sorry, your coverage is going to be lower. US media coverage does matter. Yes, it does impact on what countries the Japanese media chooses to cover. And then the other one that we rarely see, or almost never see in the research, is the country relatively poor? And the answer is yes, this really matters. So it means that the Japanese media is interested in your country if you are rich. And if you're not, well, you don't really count. And so we measured this by looking at the poverty headcount. This is the number of people, or the percentage of the population living under what is known as the ethical poverty line. What was equally as interesting as what was covered, or what mattered, is what doesn't matter. GDP didn't seem to matter. And trade between Japan and that country also didn't seem to matter. So it seems that the bilateral economic relations between Japan and other countries is less important than whether the New York Times happens to be talking about your country or not. So we see this influence, this strong influence. So this was our study about the Japanese media. Now we also, let me just provide you with a couple of anecdotal additions to this. So we saw, for example, we see very frequently how the Japanese media has this great power to influence what the Japanese media is talking about. Case in point, the Global South. The term, the Global South. I'm imagining one or two of us have probably heard of this term before, Global South. If you lived in Japan, up until last year, you may not have heard so much about that term. So you can see, this is a lineup of how many times the word Global South was mentioned in the Japanese media, starting from, and we started looking from 2021, going up to almost the present. And let's just say that it didn't come up very much in the media. That's a zero. That's a hard zero you're seeing there. And you can keep going back to 1969 when the term was first introduced. You will not find that word in the Japanese media. Global South did not exist, was not there. They'll talk about developing countries, a loaded term. That's the word that shows up. They won't say the Global South. Okay, yellow, blue, and gray lines there are each of the three Japanese newspapers. The black line at the bottom, this is good old Prime Minister Kishida in Japan. This is the number of times he mentioned it. Okay, he started to sort of mention it in November, December last year. He got really excited about the term in January this year, and suddenly the media, out of the blue, is suddenly interested in the Global South, which they had no interest in up until the Prime Minister of Japan started talking about it. Did the Global South exist before then? I think so. Did something radically change within the Global South? I don't think so. So we get the picture about what is the factor that's influencing this, right? Now, you could say to me, but wait a minute. India did a conference on the Global South in January of this year. They invited 120 countries to that conference, and they did an online conference about that Surely the Japanese media is responding to that rather than their own prime minister. Sorry to disappoint. The Asahi and Mainichi newspapers did not even mention that that conference happened. They're really interested in the Global South, but not really interested in the Global South. They're interested if the Prime Minister mentions it. So we can see a really, really clear line between the government and the media in international affairs. Let me give you one more anecdotal influence about the US. I'm not sure how many of us are aware about this, one of the world's largest bank robberies that happened recently. Like $7 billion? Anybody? $7 billion went missing from the Afghanistan Central Bank. Well, let's just say it wasn't in Afghanistan. It was the Afghanistan Central Bank's money, but the US was just keeping it for them, like safekeeping. In the US, this was going on for years and years and years. Okay, what happens in 2021? The Taliban takes over, and suddenly the Afghan Central Bank account is no longer their bank account. The US decides to freeze it. A couple of months later, they make a decision. What are we going to do with Afghanistan's money? Okay, half of it, we'll get it back to the Afghanistan's people, but not through the Taliban. So we'll put that in a Swiss bank account, and we'll keep it there, and until we decide what to do with it, it's still there. It's still there 2 years later. The other half, well, we have a lot of people who were victims or families of the victims of the September 11th terrorist attacks, and they're suing us now, and we might need money for that. And Afghanistan equals September 11th. They did it. It's their fault, so we'll take that money and we'll use it to... You get the logic, right? So the US is kind of just holding on to that $3.5 billion. And then the other half, there's a point. Just hold on, I'm getting there. The other half, they said they're going to give to the Afghanistan people. They're going to give it as humanitarian assistance. Logic, everybody, stick with me here. The money was Afghans' money. The US was holding on to it. They give it back to them. They give them back their own money, so it's humanitarian assistance, right? Makes sense, right? Makes sense. Okay, on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a photo that shows you the headlines of 4 or 5 Japanese major newspapers, all the ones I mentioned. All of them mentioned this happening, this bank robbery. They mentioned it in one article, like roughly one article each. The headline of every single one, without exception, the headline of every single one of those articles was America giving humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. Every single one. You can't argue with logic, right? You get my point. If somebody says this, and I mean, okay, I don't want to give the Japanese media too much trouble. I mean, somebody was in a press conference just like this. The US guy, the US government official at the front said, we're giving $3.5 billion in humanitarian assistance to the Afghan people. And the Japanese reporter sits there and takes notes, and then he takes it back, and then it's in the newspaper, and that's news. Yeah? Now, anybody who stopped to think about that for just one moment would realize that that's not really how humanitarian assistance works. But it's there in every single headline of every newspaper, and that's a pattern, I think, that we can say exists. Okay, my final slide before I hand over. Just, as you can see, the news media, let's say the mainstream news media, is dealing with a lot of constraints here. So we've seen with our good friend Kishida and also with the US government's influence, we can see that there's going to be some kind of influence. And sometimes it might be just taking notes and passing it on without thinking, but this may also be linked to some kind of direct or indirect pressure to act in a certain way, to avoid being regulated, to avoid being taxed, to avoid being bullied in some form or another. Or it might be just about how much access do you have to a press conference. Are they going to hit you up with a question when you ask it? Sorry, totally unrelated. I don't know if anybody is up to date on the most important news in Japan at the moment. The Johnny's idol group manager scandal. It's basically an agency for talent, for young men, young boys, talent agency, really, really big in Japan, hugely powerful in the entertainment industry. The news media is now reporting that the founder of that agency was sexually assaulting a lot of the people that were under their agency. And it was very, very well known for a long time, it just wasn't reported on. And we saw that this was related to the fact that, well, if you report on this, we're not going to provide you with our talent, and then therefore your TV station will not benefit. And the most recent update to this story is they did a press conference kind of like this, and they had this list of the people who were not allowed to ask questions. They had like the name and the face, and they're like, this person is not allowed to ask. If you see them, you don't. If you see them with a hand up, don't give them that question. The list for you is here right now, so I'll be applying that later. But my point is that there are any number of ways that governments can withhold access and punish you if you don't say things that they like. Financial, Delio also mentioned this. Of course, advertising means keeping things interesting, things that people are interested in. You need an interested and a paying audience, and this is also a massive issue. And I think the final point I'll make is this issue of nationalism. I think in the case of whatever benefits Japan, then that will be important for the media. And it also kind of becomes secondhand, because I think we also want to have this important story of us as the good guys and our allies as the good guys, and that also, I think, has a massive impact on our coverage. And so with that, I'll stop and I'll hand it over to Namie for her presentation.
All right. Thank you, Professor. And now I'd like to...
Thank you.
Okay, so now, considering what Delio has talked about and what Professor Hawkins has talked about, these gaps and these issues that we have within the world in general and also international coverage of Japanese media, I'd like to talk to you about our very biased potential solution about Global News View, our media organization that tries to address this news gap in Japan. And so this was founded in 2016 by Professor Hawkins, and I've been fortunate enough to be a part of this project from 2019 onwards, and I think Delio has written a few articles as a guest writer as well. So I'd like to introduce you to what we do as a potential solution. So the main thing Global News View does is we publish analysis articles, and these come in two different forms, Global View and News View. So Global View talks about how these world events and these world issues that are not covered within the world, and we go take a deep dive and we try not to oversimplify anything, and we go through all these complex issues. And this is published once a week unless we have a News View article instead, and a News View article talks about the issues or how the Japanese media is covering international news. And we look at these trends, and some of them Professor has covered just now, and we see potential issues that are covered in the Japanese media. We also have a podcast that's published twice a month that also talks about these issues. We also have monthly reports of how each month, what kind of news the Japanese media is covering. We do a deep dive into data analysis on that, looking at databases of the newspapers. And we also have this one photo world, Ichimai Warudo. It's a picture of the underreported world, just kind of more fun and easy rather than our more serious Global News View articles where we just show a snapshot of the world that you might not see in everyday media. Okay, so let me explain a little bit further about what we do in Global View, first of all. So this is a world analysis article, and we talk about an underreported issue in an underreported area of the world, and we have a comprehensive overview. We look at the causes, we look at the current status of the situation, and we'll end with some potential solutions to this issue. Now, what's unique about us is that we divide the world into 7 different categories, and we rotate through this. So we got, for example, East, South, and Central Asia, and we might do that one week, and then that would be followed by an article about a region or a country in Southeast Asia, an issue that's happening there. Then we'd go on to Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, the Americas, and then we have one final category called global issues, where we look at potential issues that covers and affects the entire world. And one thing we don't cover is that we don't cover Japan, we don't cover the Koreas, we don't cover China, we don't cover the US, we don't cover UK, Germany, France, Russia, because these countries are already covered. You saw the map earlier. These were the countries that were blue. These were the countries that are already getting coverage by existing media, so we don't really cover issues that are happening in those countries. I mean, of course, we'll cover them when they're affecting an issue in a country out of these 7 categories, which usually they are. So that's the only time we'll really mention them. So here are a couple of examples, these pictures here of our recent articles as a global issue. It's cut off at the top, but as a global issue, we talked about recently shipping and greenhouse gas emissions and how that covers the entire world. A recent Europe article we had is about Sweden and what does it mean to incorporate gender into diplomacy. So here are a couple examples of what we do in Global View. Okay, so to move on to what we do for News View, these are news analysis articles, and it's about international news coverage by the Japanese media. So using databases, we'll look at trends, we look at the volume of coverage, we look at regional distribution, and we'll look at what kind of topics are covered and what kind of topics are not covered. And we mainly collect data from the 3 big newspapers, Asahi, Mainichi, and Yomiuri. But sometimes we also cover other media outlets, like for example, how NHK covers world news, or how Smart News, the news app on your phone, how they cover world news. And it ends up being about the same, where they cover the blue countries, but not the rest of them. So a couple of recent examples. The top one here is about peace reporting in Ukraine and Russia. Of course, we all know that the conflict of Ukraine and Russia is going on, and the media likes to cover this. But out of this, the yellow part is about 4 to 6%. Only 4 to 6% is about actual peace reporting, or like something related to peace agreements, and everything else is really about the conflict or the war, the more negative things, as Delio mentioned earlier, the negative things that get more news. And then another article we recently talked about is the current state of health and medical issues in the underreported world. This is something that the Japanese media also tends to overlook. So instead, GMV covered an article on that. Okay, another thing we like to do at the end of the year, each year, is we do a ranking system and we publish an article about the top 10 undercovered news stories of the year. So as an example, I've brought up what we chose as the top 10 undercovered news stories of 2022. And so as we rank this, we look at the 7 different categories of how we divide up the world, and we look at which ones were affecting the most people, which ones affected the most regions, which ones happened this year, and which ones were undercovered, which ones were not covered. So for number 1, this is something that Professor Hawkins just mentioned. The US government takes $3.5 billion from Afghanistan's central bank. This only really received 1 article from each newspaper, even though this is pretty important, pretty big news that, affects a lot of people. And so I've highlighted some of these pictures. Number 2 was the world's biggest trading and mining company, Glencore, was fined for $1.6 billion. Number 3, East Africa, 36.1 million people were severely affected by drought, but this didn't get any coverage within the Japanese newspapers. Number 5, Latin America, a series of massive leaks by an activist hacker group, the Guacamaya, who leaked a lot of inconvenient information to these governments. But again, this wasn't really taken up by the Japanese media. Number 7, record heat wave arrived simultaneously in the Arctic and Antarctica. Again, not covered. And lastly, number 10, that picture up there is economic crisis in Laos doubles oil prices. This affected many people in that region, but again, was not covered by the Japanese media. Okay, so how do we do this? How do we run? How do we operate as an organization? Well, we are very low budget. All work, all maintenance, all writing, all editing, it's done on a voluntary basis. All of the data entry and data analysis, all volunteer work. And so the reason why we can do this as volunteer work is partly because we focus on news analysis and not news gathering. So if we had people on the ground going out and getting that news, of course that would cost lots of money. But what we do is that we can actually find most of the information in English. but it's not reported in Japanese. So we can create, using English news sources that already exist, we can take this information and we can write a comprehensive analysis article in Japanese because it doesn't exist in Japanese. And you know, in Japan, the main language is Japanese, so we need to somehow have this information available in Japanese, otherwise most people won't be able to access it. And then for our news analysis portions, we use newspaper databases. This is an example up here in this picture of the Yomiuri Shimbun database, where we can look through and see all the articles that were published. And we can do this also because we're based at Osaka University. Students and faculty are the main ones who are participating in this. And we also have guest writers who come on sometimes to talk about an area of their expertise as well. So yeah, this is how we operate as a low budget media. And because we are low budget, we can be independent. I'm gonna make a bold statement here, we're not beholden to anyone. And this is partially because, you know, we don't have these financial interests that these big media have. We don't have sponsors, so we don't have to appeal to these corporate interests. And we also, because we are free, you can find our website and just look it up and, you know, see all of our articles. There's no paywall. So we don't need to sell news also. Like, we don't have to run to sensationalism to try to sell our news. Like, we try to even cover some things that might be inconvenient to Japan. If Japan's doing something wrong, well, we might write about it. So there's that part of it as well, and we also don't have these access interests, like the press conference. You know, it would be nice if we could go to a press conference, but we also don't need to. The news is already there as an English news source, so we don't have to go, and we don't have to try to appeal to them and try to say, hey, Chinese, can you please let us in? We'll do whatever you say. We don't have to do that, thankfully. So there's that part of it, and so because of that also, there's no need for self-censorship for us, so we can annoy whoever we want to as part of it. So yeah, that's it for us, and thank you very much, and please let us know if you have questions.
Yeah, I think we probably have room for one question, I guess, in terms of time. Yeah. While we're waiting.
Yeah, you sort of kind of went over it quite quickly, but I was wondering whether you could dig more into that distinction between poverty headcount mattering a lot, but GDP not mattering that much as a determining factor. I think you also said GDP and trade, yeah. Because I assume it's not out of kind of very naive focus on caring about some economic statistics but not caring about others. So I'm wondering how you think about what perhaps like knock-on, what that difference indicates.
Sure. Okay, well, I mean, if it were GDP per capita, then that might tell us something. But then, of course, because of inequality in societies, then GDP per capita doesn't really tell us that much, I guess. Now, the poverty headcount, yeah, as I said, it's people living below, it's the percentage of people living below the so-called ethical poverty line, which is 7.5 or 7.4, 7.5 dollars per day. Sorry, that's the measure. We did the same. We used the same. We did the same analysis for the World Bank measure, which is 1.9 dollars per day, and got the same result. So poverty, whichever measure we used, was giving us the same result. Now, yeah, I mean, we are also somewhat, I wouldn't say confused, but I mean, we would also like to explore more as to why GDP didn't matter. And I mean, and that would not be necessarily related to the poverty idea, because GDP is just the GDP as a whole. So if you've got a large population and you've got a fairly well-functioning economy, then that kind of works. I mean, one possible answer to that might be that it's just, for the Japanese media, it's not enough to be big. So for example, Brazil, quite a large GDP, not per capita, but a large GDP, and yet in the Japanese media, it will get covered if you're going to have a World Cup there or an Olympics there, but otherwise forget about it. So you've got some large countries that are large in terms of the actual GDP per se, not per capita, but they're not getting covered. So that might help us to explain that a little bit more. The explanation of why poverty matters, why the poverty headcount matters, I think has a lot to do with the idea of the ability to identify, which means, are these people like us? And so we didn't address the kind of elephant in the room, which is something that might be racial or ethnic, which can also, and we've tried to explore that. We can't pin it down statistically, but we interviewed a lot of media personnel. It does exist. We're getting also a lot of denials. It's kind of a bit difficult to point down, but just the idea that that somebody is kind of like us. And I always give the example of, okay, if you're in Japan and I ask somebody, okay, have you ever been in an airplane before? Have you been in a high-rise building? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Okay, September 11th happens, planes hit buildings. Your next thought is, it could have been me, right? But if you're a thatched hut in a village in rural Central African Republic gets burned down, the question of it could have been me is not really necessarily going to come up. And so these are people not like us in Japan in terms of socioeconomic status. And I think that makes quite a difference. Yeah. I think that's our time, if I'm not mistaken. Yes? Okay. Sorry. So if you've got other questions, I think you can find us around. But otherwise, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.